What no one tells you about losing a spouse, Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands, is that you'll still set the table for two, 3 months after the funeral. She smoothed the interview notes before her. 47 years of muscle memory doesn't disappear overnight. Across the table, Thomas nodded. 6 years for me, he said, and I still roll over in the morning, careful not to disturb her side of the bed. We interviewed 36 seniors who had lost their spouses. Some were newly widowed. Others had been carrying their grief for decades. But almost none of them spoke about the things we expected. Not the funeral, not the paperwork, not even the first holidays spent alone. What they shared instead was quieter and far harder to name. They spoke of the invisible threads that unravel over time, of the routines that collapse without witness, and the loneliness that arrives not in storms, but in echoes. Everyone warns you about the tsunami, Margaret said. No one prepares you for the tide that never goes out. What they revealed in these conversations doesn't just reshape how we think about grief. It quietly changes how we understand love itself. You've wondered about it, haven't you? That final horizon we all face. Not just our own mortality, but the moment when someone who has shaped our days is suddenly, irrevocably absent. Perhaps you've already walked this path, or perhaps you've watched someone you love navigate its terrain, wanting to help, but not knowing how. Or maybe you simply sense it waiting, that inevitable crossing we cannot prepare for, no matter how we try. We speak of grief in stages and timelines, as though it moves in predictable patterns. But those who have lived through it know different truths, quieter realities that rarely find voice in sympathy cards or well-meaning advice. Robert, 84, sat with perfect posture despite the cane propped against his chair. His wife had been gone for 11 years. No one tells you about the questions, he said, looking past us to the window. Not the big existential ones. Those come later. I mean the small, daily questions you suddenly have no one to ask. He leaned forward slightly. For 40 years, I never chose a tie without showing her first. Never scheduled a doctor's appointment without checking our shared calendar. Never decided what to have for dinner without considering her preferences. His hands, spotted with age but steady, rested on the table. Grief isn't just missing the person. It's having to become a whole new version of yourself, one who makes every small decision alone. He smiled faintly. The first time I bought bed sheets by myself, I stood in the store for an hour. She always knew the thread count we preferred. Everyone brought food, Julia said, her voice still carrying traces of her native Louisiana at 79. For weeks after Richard died, my freezer was packed, but then it stopped. She straightened the sleeve of her blouse with careful fingers. What no one tells you is that the hardest time isn't those first raw weeks when everyone surrounds you. It's month 4, month 7. When the casseroles stop coming and people expect you to be better, but you're just beginning to understand the geography of your loss. She looked directly at us. That's when the real wilderness begins. When people stop asking how you are because they think they know, or because they're afraid you'll actually tell them. Her eyes shone with unexpected tears. 6 months after, I dropped a carton of eggs in the grocery store, made a terrible mess, and I stood there crying, not because of the eggs, but because there was no one in the world who would find it funny in exactly the way Richard would have. No one who would retell the story at dinner parties for years, always making me both the hero and the fool in the kindest possible way. She dabbed at her eyes. That's a loneliness they don't warn you about, losing the one witness to your ordinary life. I was prepared to miss her laugh, Michael told us, his work-worn hands folded neatly on the table. At 89, he had been a widower for nearly 20 years. I was prepared to miss her voice, her cooking, even our arguments, but I wasn't prepared to inherit her friendships. He explained how his wife's closest friends, women he'd known peripherally for decades, began including him in their gatherings. They'd invite me to their Saturday brunches, save me a seat at community events. At first, I thought it was pity. His expression softened. It took me years to understand they weren't just checking on me. They were keeping their connection to her alive. Through me, they could still love her. He paused, and through them, I learned parts of my wife I never knew. Stories from before we met. Secrets she'd shared with them, but not me. His eyes crinkled at the corners. No one tells you that your spouse can still surprise you, even after they're gone. Catherine, elegant at 75 in a simple blue dress, spoke of the physical dimensions of loss. The silence was expected, she said. The emptiness of his closet, the absence of his snoring. I anticipated that. What I didn't expect was how my body would keep seeking his. She described how, months after her husband's passing, she would still shift to his preferred side of the couch, leaving space where he should be. How she would wake reaching for his hand. How she would turn to share a thought, mouth already forming words before remembering. Your body learns patterns over decades, she explained. Your cells remember, and they don't surrender those memories easily. She touched her wedding ring, still worn 7 years after his death. Sometimes I think true grief isn't just emotional. It's cellular. Every part of you has to learn the absence. Her gaze was steady, but here's what else they don't tell you. Those same cells that remember loss can eventually learn new patterns too. Not replacement, never that, but continuation. Your heart breaks, but it keeps beating. As these elders shared their journeys through grief, certain truths emerged. Not the platitudes of sympathy cards, but hard-won wisdom from the landscape of loss. Many spoke of time, not as a healer, but as a translator. Grief doesn't shrink, explained Thomas. You just build more life around it. The pain doesn't disappear. It gets integrated into who you're becoming. This recognition that grief isn't something to overcome, but to incorporate, offers a gentler measure of progress than the pressure to move on. Almost all mentioned the unexpected permission that came with loss. Permission to reinvent routines, to disappoint others, to discover new facets of themselves. After 52 years of compromise, I had to learn what I actually preferred, said Eleanor. What I wanted for dinner, what time I naturally woke up, what temperature I liked the house. In the absence of shared preferences, they found themselves strangers to their own desires, embarking on a second coming of age no one had prepared them for. Perhaps most surprisingly, many spoke of continuing bonds rather than broken ones. Death ends a life, said Robert, but not a relationship. They described ongoing conversations with their spouses, debates about politics at the breakfast table, whispered questions before sleep, imagined reactions to new grandchildren or world events. These weren't described as denial or delusion, but as natural evolutions of love that death had transformed but not terminated. It was Margaret, 72, and widowed just 18 months, who offered the perspective that shifted the room's energy. After listening intently to others' experiences, she straightened in her chair. "Everyone talks about grief, like it's the price we pay for love," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word, "as though it's a terrible burden we accept in exchange for having loved deeply." She shook her head, silver hair catching the light. "But that's backward. Grief isn't the cost of love. Grief is love with nowhere physical to go. It's all that love you built over years or decades, still living in you, but suddenly without its familiar home." The room fell silent as her words settled. When I understood that my pain was actually my love, I stopped trying to get over my grief. How could I want to get over my love? In that moment, grief transformed from enemy to evidence, proof of a connection that continues beyond presence. What if we've misunderstood grief entirely? What if it's not a process of letting go, but of finding new ways to hold on? Perhaps grief is not the closing of a door, but the opening of another, one that leads to a relationship transformed but not terminated. Not a goodbye, but a translation. Not an ending, but a different kind of continuation. The elders who shared their journeys with us weren't people who had moved on from their losses. They were people who had moved forward with them, carrying their loves not as burdens, but as lights that still illuminate the path. Even in their physical absence, as you walk your own path, whether through grief already known or that which still waits beyond the horizon, remember what these elders learned through their loneliest nights and gradually brightening days. That grief may change shape, but doesn't require an expiration date. That healing doesn't mean forgetting. That the most profound connections we form in this life don't simply vanish when touch is no longer possible. Perhaps the most powerful truth they shared is this: we don't recover from great love, nor should we want to. We simply learn to carry it differently, no longer in our arms, but in our hearts, no longer in presence, but in perspective, no longer in moments shared, but in a life shaped. And in that carrying, we honor what remains most true: that love, once given and received, never actually leaves us. It becomes us. If this journey through the hidden landscapes of grief resonated with you, join us next week for The Things They Saved. Seniors share the objects that tell their life stories. Another quiet exploration of the small treasures that hold our most profound connections.